So let's get this started. Hello everybody and welcome to the Strategy Show. I'm your host Simon Severino. This episode is brought to you by the Strategy Sprints. At Strategy Sprints we do only one thing, strategy in sprints. Strategy means more revenue every month. In sprints means while having fun. Because you will need this fun, because there will be hard times, and business is a series of sprint. You will need that energy and that motivation for the next one. As always, every week we try and find the brightest minds around so that you as a CEO can learn as much as possible about the current situation and the best tools to cope with it. I am particularly honored this week to have Thomas Seifert on our show. Hi, Thomas.
Hi, how are you doing?
Second time on this show. Thomas is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the Wiener Zeitung, and the two books that we are going to talk most about of his books are Pazifische, Epoche and Schwarzbuch. I'm super excited to have you here, Thomas.
Me too.
Let's start on a personal note. Tell the readers a little bit, the listeners, what are you currently going through? How is this current situation for you as a human being?
Well, it's a twofold thing, I guess, for a journalist. First of all, it's probably the most interesting and exciting time to work in as a journalist, because this is a global crisis. This is a pandemic. The last time something like that happened was in 1918. Some argue that it was also maybe 1968 with the Hong Kong flu or 1957 with the Asia flu. But I think this is what most people will maybe not remember as being that dire. Actually, it was. I mean, in both of these pandemics, between 1 and 2 million people died. And we're heading into that direction, I think, right now. So it's exciting. On the other hand, of course, from a personal experience, is that, of course, our world has completely changed for, I think, most of us, at least in countries like Austria or Europe, the United States, New Zealand, Japan, wherever we are, things have changed dramatically. And this is the other thing. But I should also add that I think I've written an essay, I can't remember, maybe it was in end of March or something, because I also used to be and still am a crisis reporter. So I reported from Ebola crisis in Uganda in 2000, and I have been in reporting from different wars, from Afghanistan, Iraq, also in the Congo and other places. So for me, being in an extraordinary situation was not that new, and I was at that time writing in the Wiener Zeitung, that I still was surprised that with basically you should have that foresight how things can change, because we knew it from when it started in Wuhan and then it came to Italy, and of course it crept closer and closer. And still, I have to admit that I didn't foresee what would be happening. So it's an interesting, I think, human trait that even rationally you might know about what's coming at you. You still kind of push it away, and you still pretend it's not really happening. At least it's not happening to you, because also, as being a war reporter or crisis reporter, what usually happens, if it's enough, you have your story, or you have enough, you just hop on a plane and go home. But now there is no place to go, because the whole thing is everywhere. And probably one of the safest places to be right now is in Vienna, a place with an excellent healthcare system, with I think that with a good policy reaction to the crisis. And we have been spared of the worst, at least in this country. So yeah, being home is probably the best place to be at this moment.
From your perspective, you see much more than the average of us sees, and you are writing about these things. What are one or two big misconceptions, big illusions that we people are sitting on right now that you can help us uncover?
The misconceptions. Well, First of all, it's never as bad as you make it out in your fantasy, because we all have seen blockbuster movies like Outbreak or Contagion or maybe the zombie apocalypse or something like that, and it's not that, right? So people think that society might collapse and all these things, and this is fortunately this didn't happen, at least not in not now, not yet. And I think that is the first thing that is should be, I think, positive thing to us, that okay, things are never usually as bad as you think they are. But the other misconception is that before things actually happen, you think that's not going to be that bad. So what my takeaway is, and this is basically something, a philosophy in my life, is prepare for the worst but hope for the best. And I think this is always something that a lot of people, especially in the business world, do not understand, that this is a very important principle of modus operandi, to really prepare for the worst but still also hope for the best. And another problem, I think, especially in the business world, but also in policy circles, is I have studied natural science. I am a botanist by training. I have a degree in natural science. And most people who are in business, who are in politics, they have studied law, maybe they have studied business or something like that. And and I'm very shocked usually how little the knowledge is and the know-how is when it comes to things like biology, physics, maybe also the climate, which is another topic that's coming right after. Once we have finished with COVID-19, this will not go away, and this is real, and it's like a COVID-19 in slow motion. What's heading, towards us, and I think that is something that also I encourage people to. If you neglect nature, you do this on your own peril, because we have seen a virus of this sort, the coronavirus. It basically has just a little RNA strand with very limited amount of genes and a protein lipid hull around it. It's a very simple, I'm not even saying an organism, because it's only life once it reproduces in your cell. It needs us as hosts for this virus. But such a simple thing can turn humanity upside down, and can turn business upside down, politics upside down, societies upside down. And I think that is something that I think when people become arrogant and they think, okay, we're not even part of nature, we are something detached from nature, we are superior beings. No, it's not the case. We live on this planet, we share this planet with other organisms, and without this planet we're nothing. So I hope that this is a takeaway for a lot of managers and politicians and people, that to understand that we are sharing this planet with other organisms, and we are actually manipulating the planet in a very significant ways, and we have to be more careful. That is, I think, something that also and I could go on this, because, for instance, when it comes to flu pandemics, another one could also come. There is some risky strands out there that might hit us as well as pandemic. If that's the influenza A type, and this has to do with husbandry, with animal husbandry, and the way we do agriculture, probably makes the crisis worse. And the same is probably also with the coronavirus. So we are not innocent in this. This is not something that just happened. I'm afraid we will see more of that in the future, and not less of it, because we've been just lucky with SARS, with MERS, with Ebola. The last, all of this could have been pandemics, the flu, the swine flu, the bird flu. I mean, there's a lot of, I think, risks out there. And I think generally, as I said before, people usually underestimate risks.
So the one level is very tangible for me. It is the air that I exhale, this plant is inhaling, and the air that this plant exhales, I am inhaling. We are absolutely dependent and connected. And now this is the moment where the whole world feels it, and it's the chance. My big question mark is, how is it possible that we were so unprepared? The knowledge was there, but most of our governments, if we look on a global level, were really unprepared. Some reacted very well. Every government did their best. But what's your take? Why are we so unprepared, and what does it mean for the second wave, the third wave that we have to expect?
If you allow me, I would go back in history and come to the flu pandemic of 1918. Of course, Europe was just at the end of the war was approaching. The Austrian Empire was basically finished, as was the German Reich. And Europe was in chaos because, of course, there was war in France, in Belgium, and on the Western Front, there was a revolution in 1917, started in what then became the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire. So Europe was in chaos. So let's focus on that. So 1918 came, the pandemic, burned until actually 1919, and the world reacted. And the first thing they did was they started an office in Vienna, I should say. It was the International Committee of the Red Cross, which was at that time in Geneva and still is in Geneva. And they started this office here in Vienna, and they focused on epidemics. So that was the first reaction that the world understood. Okay, the problem in 1918 because of the war and the fragmentation, because there were warring parties, the United States with the French and the British here, and then the Germans and the Austrians there, and so that didn't really help, of course, in the effort to fight a pandemic, because if other humans are your enemy and you should actually focus on this virus, it didn't happen. And I think that some people understood that, and so they started this office. And then I think when I remember correctly, it was another when the League of Nations came along with Wilsonian with this Wilsonian vision, the League of Nations. They also started this office, and also, of course, that collapsed. And the Second World War came, and things were forgotten somehow. And but what they did, and that was pretty smart, that after World War II, they started the WHO, and that was an independent body and not part of the UN framework, because they understood, okay, we should not politicize this, because the League of Nations collapsed and the UN also, let's just do this something different, because we really know, okay, this is something else. This should be outside politics, and we should all focus on fighting the next pandemic. And I think there you have already your answer why we were so unprepared, because it was underfunded. The WHO was not really funded well. And again, also, as we know, that the human cooperation has collapsed more and more after, let's say, even I would say probably the Iraq war in 2003 was the straw that broke the camel's back, when suddenly things really fell apart, and there was a really maybe very short period of cooperation, and even that is not true, because we remember the Yugoslav war, etc. So this was never really happening, and I think that is something that also for me is hard to understand. Why still here we are in the COVID pandemic, the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, and there is still no cooperation. And that is, I think, in the United States actually withdrawing from the WHO. They're accusing the WHO that they have been too close to the Chinese, and that may or may not be true. I mean, this is an open debate, but still, we would think that, okay, let's not fight about these things. Let's just focus on the problem that's in front of us, and that is to fight this pandemic globally, to come up with a vaccine, to come up with medication that works. This is what's ahead of us, and what we see is a nationalism. Also, even in Europe, the first thing we had borders, we had hoarding of medical equipment, and collaboration and cooperation collapsed. And I think this is what the virus, I think, is showing us, in a sense, that basically this virus is switching on and off the light and say, hello, guys, we really need to cooperate in this planet a little bit more. And it's a warning, because again, as I said, the climate change is the next crisis that's already here. I mean, if you observe temperatures and the climate in Europe and this part of the world where we sit right now, you see that the temperatures are out of whack already, and then this is a real crisis, and we also have to fight this together. And as long as this is not happening, I think it's a pretty big picture, because the next challenge will be how to distribute and produce, millions and actually billions of doses of vaccine. And this is a global endeavor, and I'm not seeing that it's happening. But going back to your question, why were we not prepared? First of all, I think, and again, society is underestimating risks generally. I mean, just look at how many nuclear events we had in the past. I mean, this was seemed to be, they told us, yeah, it's 10,000 of years. There's no risk in it. We had Chernobyl, we had Fukushima, we had Harrisburg, 3 Mile Island. So I think that what really people should worry about is a total underestimation of risk. And there's many risks out there. I mean, I could come up with a whole list. Let's say if we had a computer virus on top of the coronavirus right now, this would mean game over for the way we do business, right? Because what's cushioning us in the developed world is that if that would have happened 15, 20 years ago before the internet, we would have been in a very different situation. Our logistics would be in a different situation. Homeschooling would not be possible. Many other things that we do, or this what we're just doing, would not be possible. So I think people should focus more on risks, and this should be part of any business that you have, it's small or not. What is my worst case scenario? What could possibly go wrong? And you don't dwell on it. You're not going depressive and say, well, the world is ending, but you really focus and say, okay, everything that could go wrong can actually go wrong. So let's focus on my weakest links, and let's strengthen them. And let's make sure that we have a plan B always, maybe a plan Z, that we have parallel structures, that we have simple financial management. So not these levels of complexity that the financial service industry has. I think it's very dangerous, because if something happens, you don't know how this will ripple through your system. And the same is true with the logistics. So if you have very complex logistics change and production and also the rest of it, also that is, I think, taking complexity out of the system is a good thing to do. You should start that always. You should always have that in place. And then also making sure that that you have that all the structures in your company, in politics, in society, that they should be resilient. I think resilient is the key word of our time. And even I think Nicholas Taleb was this mathematician who said, well, who wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, and it would even be better to have something that actually not only absorbs the shock, but gets somehow strengthened by a shock like that. And this is the best thing we could hope for our societies, that we not only absorb this shock, but we actually learn something from it and get more strength once we get out of this.
Beautiful. I ask everybody on the show, and we have different assumptions there. Will there be a new normal after this? On the one side, we have Ben Pring and other futurists saying there will be no new normal. There has never been a new normal. Everything that can go digital will go digital. Everything was broken before, and now we are just seeing that it is broken, like flying around, etc. And on the other side, we have entrepreneurs and employees saying, well, okay, for 2 months now, I will just duck and cover and then come back and do everything as always. What's your take?
Well, this I think is a very interesting and important question. First of all, my take is that, of course, this is all depends on the virus. Will the virus become more virulent? Will it become more deadly? Usually that's not happening. This is usually these viruses should get less deadly. Why? Because the evolution obviously is that we want, basically, the better it spreads, the better it is. But if it kills everyone, it ends in the grave. Just getting out of circulation. So usually what we saw in different circumstances that viruses usually get less virulent. For instance, that happened with the Spanish flu. It basically diluted into a flu that now more or less the daughters and great-granddaughters and sons of this virus, so to speak, this RNA mutated and is still more or less generations after it are still around. So that is, but again, we're totally dependent on what this virus does, how it will spread, how well we can contain it, if we get a vaccination, if we get medication, if we can, mitigate the whole problem. So that is number one. But let's assume that the prognosis is correct, that we have maybe a vaccine in 2 years, that we have more better medication, that we learn, to kind of social distancing in a way that will not kill the economy. And I think we are just about, now learning it and trying it and testing the water. How thin is the ice that we can walk on? This is what Europe is just doing. This is what America is just doing. And I think they are too fast, because we have been more careful in many ways, and more testing, etc. But anyway, this is, I think, what we are in. And do I think and then again, once this is over, you will have a a quite fast rebound in economic terms in the first phase, which will then be a slower rebound going back to what was before. So I think anybody who thinks that this is like a V-shaped recession is wrong. I don't think this will happen. And also, I think societies will change. I could give you, many examples of how societies were changed through epidemics, going back to 1918. For instance, it definitely changed the course of World War One. It shortened it because, of course, soldiers that are sick cannot fight. That was good. Probably that saved lives. On the other hand, of course, the virus killed so many people, 50 million altogether. And it was only in Europe where more people died in the war than with the virus. So actually, give and take, it was very bad, right? So a pandemic the outcomes are usually bad because people lose their lives. But once we want to learn from it, means how can we adjust our lives and what can we learn from it? And that means that, first of all, again, we need to be prepared better the next time. As I said before, also changing some ways of doing business and changing our societies, taking complexity out, etc. What I said before. And the other thing is, I think that also it's a warning shot in a sense for climate change. So going through it, when it comes to travel, that will be affected for a long time, I think. And probably the solution for most things will be you get a test for the virus. This time is testing for if you have a virus material in your body. And then, of course, in the second phase, immunologic test if you are immune or if you have a built-up immunity against SARS-CoV-2. And so that will be the first phase of getting out of it. So that before you enter a plane, you get maybe tested. Before you go to a concert or to the museum or to whatever, you're getting tested to your office. That could be one solution to get out of it. And then when it comes to changing mindsets, I think also the mentality might change, because a lot of people sat at home now since in Austria it was at least the weekend of March 13th, the Friday, people sat at home, and maybe some people recalibrated and rethought what is really important in their lives, what they need, what they don't need, how they want to continue their lives, and what they maybe want to change. I also wouldn't overestimate this, because I think people are they don't want change. Most people just want to continue the way they did. But I think, and my hunch is that those people who understood quickly what was going on are those who go out successful through this crisis. And this is the case with countries. Those who neglected the problem, those who just pretended it's not there, they will have a lot of pain. I mean, both in people who lose their lives, and also in economic pain, and also in political disruption, because a government that cannot safeguard the security and health of the citizens is not a government that should be in place and should be sitting in government. So I think there will be a lot of changes. And we will see them in all sorts of things, like consumption, your way of life, the arts. I mean, I think there will be results. I mean, this will express itself maybe in curious ways that I cannot foresee now. But I'm in the camp who says, well, people will want to continue the way they did, because this is just, I think, in human nature for most people. And I think that those who understand quickly that what has changed, and maybe what ways our lives could change or could already have begin to change, these will be the ones that are definitely will be more successful.
Absolutely. If we look at a society as a whole, which part do you think is more impacted than other parts in economic terms, in behavioral terms?
Well, I think the figures show, of course, at the moment, it's definitely everything that has to do with tourism is very badly affected. That means for countries that depend on tourism, that it begins with, let's say, Thailand, or of course also in Europe, it's Austria, it's Spain, it's Croatia, it's Italy, it's Portugal. I mean, so many countries really have a huge tourism industry. And of course, if the hotel closes, then it also means that the bakery sells less bread. That means that the butcher sells less meat to the hotel. and we all know this ripples through the whole economy. So that is something that's happening. And then also everybody who, and this is, I think, the tragedy of a virus and the tragedy of a pandemic like this, everybody who has to be with people, maybe in a close encounter even, that will be hit. Let's start with a massage therapist, or people even might not want to go to the doctor, even if they should, right? Because they are afraid that maybe if they go to the doctors, they might catch the virus. Restaurants, any places where people meet. I mean, this means also, let's say, co-working spaces or anything of that sort. And this, I think, is a tragedy, because what I spoke before, that the thing that really makes us humans resilient is if we have the option and if we connect, right? As I said before, if we would cooperate, this crisis would end much faster than like now, unfortunately, with US President Donald Trump doing one thing, the Europeans doing another thing, the Chinese doing a third thing. Coordination would be much better, and this crisis would be much faster behind us if we would do that. And it's the same with people. If everybody have to figure out their own way to deal with it, it's much slower to adapt, and I think the outcomes might not be optimal if we had the chance to just have a big Congress. Let's say that the thousands most intelligent people on the planet figure it out together on 2 weekends. We can't do that now. We can only, like what we do, Zoom or Facebook or Skype or whatever we have. And I think that's a big problem, because we all know that human connections are deeper than just sharing, talking. There is some levels, I think, of human interaction that are very important that, of course, get lost now at the moment, both in the workplace, maybe also in your personal life, because people sleep less, people have their heads full with lots of thoughts and thorougghs. So I think that is something that we have to find ways around it to still make sure that we have these connections, that we still have forums of interaction where we can share our experiences, maybe also talk about our fears, talk about our problems. Because I think that's one other aspect that I want to share is the problem that we have. And again, I'm very much in favor of learning from the past, so not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And we have two things going on at the moment. The one is the one layer is the pandemic, right? And that's bad enough, right? But what we see developing more and more is like we have a global economic crisis, and I would even say it's a depression. It's going to be a depression. It's not going to be your random seasonal kind of blips in the curve of GDP, and it's going to be a real problem. And I think these two crises are there, and the shifts are enormous. Again, I mean, if a country that depended on oil exports, we see where that goes. What about the food supply in some countries that maybe have to import food? What about workers? Suddenly you release hundreds of thousands of guest workers, migrant workers that you don't need because there is nothing to produce, nothing to build at the moment. You just what are they going to do with them? Just send them home to their countries where they came from. So I think there is going to be a lot of political turmoil that's maybe still ahead of us. There's a lot of economic turmoil that's still ahead of us. And these problem is. And that is also interesting that complexity scientists, I think, are the flavor of the year, I would say, not of the month or the week, because these are hyper complex systems, and if you cannot fix just the pandemic, you cannot just fix the economy. You have to fix all these things together, and I think that's a very, very complex dance that we're just, I think, beginning to learn the first steps of it, I would say.
Coping with the crisis on all these levels. From my observation, I see many people losing their business, losing their job, and the amount is really huge. And then there is a small part of people that where they are growing exponentially because they have digitized or they were always digital. So they are growing exponentially. They're winning this game. They're surfing the wave, and so many are below the water. What will this do with the societal tension? What can we expect? And maybe even if you have some ideas, what can we contribute
Yeah.
to hold that tension?
Yes, I think one of the things that that you saw, again, I'm going back to 1918, the flu pandemic, is, for instance, in Korea. Korea at that time was under Japanese occupation. It was ruled by the Japanese Empire, and a lot more Koreans died in this pandemic than Japanese, because the Japanese in Korea, I'm talking about, had access to better healthcare, they had a better social situation, etc., etc. And this gave a huge boost once this pandemic, or during the pandemic, even for a Korean independence movement. The same happened in India to a certain degree, where also, the people who later became on the forefront of the independence movement, also, I think they were shaped by this pandemic. A great book by Laura Spinney about the 1918 flu, it's all in there, basically. This is where I have a lot of my knowledge from this book, and I interviewed her just recently. Terrific book. Everybody should read it now, because a lot of lessons are there that we can maybe learn that are maybe still relevant today. And if I look at this, what's going on at the moment is in the United States, we have a very similar situation. You have, if you look at the people who die, those on the lower ends of the social spectrum. A lot more Latinos die than whites. A lot more African Americans die than Caucasians. So there must be something wrong, right? And I think that will not be. I don't think this will. It will somehow change the political situation in the country, because people now suddenly inequality, which was always there, is visible. And I think it's to a lesser degree in Europe, because our healthcare systems are organized differently. Our societies are much more equal when it comes to access to healthcare, etc., than the United States. So I think Europe is a different story a little bit in this case. But in the United States, I'm sure that this will not go, this will not just pass. This will have severe social consequences and political consequences, because people can see with their own eyes who's going to die and who's not going to die, or who's dying and who's not dying. So I think that will have a big impact. And then again, I told you that I think that you have these two layers. You have the pandemic and its social consequences and political consequences. You have the economic depression, which has its own logic, so to speak. And there's another book that I will recommend you. It's by Robert McElwain, and also I interviewed him. The interview will be published. Both these interviews will be published in the Wiener Zeitung soon. And he said something interesting about what happened during the depression. And that was, and you said, okay, literally millions of people losing their jobs. Again, in the United States, more than in Europe, we have more social buffers, we have a better social security systems. But again, let's focus on the case of the United States, because everything is more expressed there. It's much more, the peaks are much more severe than in Europe. We have like 33 million, I think, unemployed already. And what happened during the Great Depression was, of course, FDR came in. He tried to mitigate the crisis after Hoover hadn't done really a good job in it, but it still wasn't enough. But what you saw at that time, that's what Robert McElwain writes, is that the middle class, which usually was aspiring towards the richer class, and maybe we can all still remember. When we would maybe have done the same, we would have want to go to an expensive restaurant, maybe buy a car that we actually don't need but looks fancy and big. And so people were kind of primed to want to be like the rich class. Maybe you cannot afford a villa in Ibiza, a finca there, but for a week you can, right, with a swimming pool and everything. And that was kind of this aspiration for luxury, aspiration for the good life that rich people would have. This was a large part of the middle class would follow this model, and then you just pretend somehow that you're part of the club in certain consumption, that maybe you for an hour, for 2 hours, for a day, for a week, you can be part of that class, and then you withdraw to what you can afford, right? And but then you lose job. What happened in the United States in the Great Depression was that the people suddenly were falling off to lower ends of the social spectrum, because again, There was next to no social security then. And what happened then was suddenly this middle class found a new sympathy and empathy and alliance with the lower class, because suddenly they were there, right? And also women, because women, and that's the case in our society as well, are also they are subjects of discrimination. So usually also their income is lower. They're part of you could also say to the underclass to a certain degree, just because there is no gender equality. So what happened then? It gave a boost. Well, that's what he writes in his book. To the labor movement. It gave a boost to, let's say, leftist politics in the United States. And also it gave a boost to the women's liberation movement, because suddenly this middle class saw, okay, well, these people that now we're part of, they really have a tough life, because now we have a tough life. So let's try to work something out. And I think that is quite interesting the quite interesting observation. And I wonder if something like that might happen as well, at least in those countries where you really have pronounced social inequality that now manifests itself. Because I think what the virus does also, it makes things visible. It makes visible who actually works in our societies who is actually essential for survival. And these are the people who work in logistics for the supermarket. Those are the people who work driving the trucks to bring us food. Those are the people who work in the butchery, etc., in the slaughterhouse. I think the virus has made social inequality visible, and I think this will definitely have some political consequence, I would guess.
Hopefully. Who should read your two books, Pazifische Epoche and Schwarzbuch Öl, and why should they read it?
Well, I wrote the book Schwarzbuch Öl in 2005 after the war in Iraq, when I was a reporter there. And I think that probably the book is not even available anymore. You have to go to a library or maybe trying to get it secondhand. But still, I think there are some interesting facts that are still relevant today when it comes to the history of oil and how oil is basically made our modern world. And I think, and that is of course now interesting, because at that time I also in the book mused about the fact what will happen, or what happens usually when you have an energy regime change. So I wrote about how the world was changed, that when the energy of the Industrial Revolution was coal. That was what the Industrial Revolution was built on, and only you could say maybe in the 30s, and of course World War II was a big boost for the oil industry. Then suddenly the energy switched, the foundation of our societies when it came to energy switched from coal to oil. And I would wonder, maybe we are on another of these pivotal moments in human history when another switch is imminent. And of course, will not happen overnight. But maybe this crisis will also, like so many other things, you mentioned digitalization, maybe it also will speed up certain developments. And I would ask governments who now, they really plunge at the billions and trillions of dollars and euros into the economy. Why would you invest into technologies that are outdated? Like if you have an opportunity to invest in a solar power plant, why would you invest in a coal power plant? If you have an opportunity to invest in electric vehicles, why would you invest in a new factory for gasoline driven vehicles or diesel vehicles? So I think that will also boost it, and especially if you are an institutional investor who piles again trillions or billions of dollars in industries, and the payout date is in 30 years from now. These industries will probably not exist anymore because maybe nobody will drive a diesel powered car anymore. So I think this will actually definitely speed up the process of going into this carbon free future when it comes to energy. And I already write about this in this book, that this is what will happen, and it will also change the world, because it will mean that the geopolitical situation will change. I mean, think of Russia, think of Saudi Arabia. I mean, these countries, they depend on exports of oil, so their political and also economic power will be very diminished, because you can produce electric energy anywhere. I mean, you have solar, you have wind. Maybe you can produce it in Morocco and somewhere in the desert. So maybe this will shift a lot of things for mostly, I think, for the better, fortunately. And also the same is true with Pacific Epoch, as it would be the translation in English. It's not available in English, unfortunately, and that was published, I think, in 2015, before Trump was in power. But also, you will find a lot of names in there that I wrote about. Like, for instance, Peter Navarro, who's now very vocal, who was one of the first people who warned about the virus, actually, and he's a big China hawk. He has you can actually watch it. I think he put a video out there and wrote a book called I think The Coming War with China or something like that. So he's really one of the people in Trump's in Trump's circle who is very much anti-Chinese. And I wrote about this kind of that how China and America, this was what Neil Ferguson, the historian, talked about, the Chimerica, how these two big powers would cooperate and would profit from each other. Apple would send the blueprints. In China, the iPhones would be built, and then they would ship them back to China to sell them in the shop for a big markup, of course. And that would make shareholders of Apple very happy. That this might be coming to an end. And again, I think that the virus speeds this process up. We can see that right now that this is happening. It's a very dangerous situation, I think, especially for Europe, because both these powers might then ask Europe to take a side. And I think for Europe, this is not a good option, because I think Europe, the economic future is in the East. I mean, the economic future, even with all the innovation that is there in the United States, etc., Asia is catching up, and also Europe is not nowhere in this. Especially when you look at 5G, at least we still have production of 5G technology in Europe. In the United States, it's a different story. So I would think that this is a very dangerous development, and Europe is only to lose, because actually what I think with the chance that Europe has is, in this situation, we want to do business with both these powers, and also I think we want to have political open channels to both these powers. And if they want us to choose and pick a side in whatever alliances they will form, this is not I think something that Europe would want to wish for. This is not good for us at all.
As a person, what did you learn about coping with uncertainty, preparing for the unthinkable?
Well, as I said, the first good thing is, I mean, when this whole thing happened, and I remember I came back from a holiday from Africa at that time. Flew back with Ethiopian Airlines. That's in big trouble at the moment. Airline flew back from Addis Ababa to Vienna, and in Addis already people had masks, and I was also following the news. Of course, the internet connection was not very good where I was at that time, so I didn't really get the full picture of what was happening. But already I saw that in Addis there was people were nervous, and then I was somehow surprised that in Austria nobody was nervous, or people were just not really that much concerned. And I remember then I think I wrote an op-ed, an opinion piece, kind of the lead opinion piece on 5th, I think, or 6th of February. And the title was, preparing for the pandemic. So I was quite concerned, and I also started to, prepare, the home and everything for this pandemic. So that means, buying some sort of medication. We didn't even have a thermometer in the house for if you have a high temperature, etc. I ordered masks and did these things but again, I was not sure that this will happen. That later happened, but I was just prepared. The most basic things for this can be prepared for the pandemic, and I think that is always good, because being prepared means that gives you assurance. Even if this material is never used, you have it, and you have something to fall back on. Okay, you have done your best, you are prepared. And I think that is something that gives at least a person like myself some sense of security, that I know, okay, I am prepared. So being a prepper, at least in some sense, is always good, because it gives you a sense of control. And I think that is then what you have to learn step by step to there is a situation, you don't know how it develops, and I think you have to be very flexible. And one day can be like this, tomorrow things can be much better, things could be much worse. I mean, that's what you don't know in a situation like this. And still, and I think now the difficult thing is, how can you be pessimistic enough to be realistic? That means you should force yourself a pessimistic worldview just again to be prepared. And at the same time, that should not drag you down. And I think that is something that is then difficult for preppers, that you are an optimistic person at the same time that you are a prepper. You know what I mean? So you think, okay, the apocalypse might happen, but still most likely not, right? So you still prepare for the apocalypse, but at the same time, okay, this is not your baseline scenario. This is the worst case scenario, and this is very unlikely that this will happen. But even if you can prepare for this very unlikely bad situation, and then keep your hopes high that, okay, what can I do next? How can I get out of this more quickly? How can I get, not lose control of the situation, be it in your work, be it in your personal life, be it and maybe in society, if you have a position to somehow shape the things that go on. I think that is this most difficult part, that to be an optimist, being a pessimist, and being a realist, and all these three things at the same time. I think that is what makes things very difficult in a situation like this, because the best thing is to be realistic, of course, and optimistic, that brings you, to embrace the next morning, and pessimistic, that is what gets you through if things just don't work out the way you thought.
Thomas, one question that I forgot to ask you.
Yes.
Which would that be?
The question that you forgot to ask me. Well, maybe what you should have asked is what is your scenario? How will this end? And I already complained about the lack of international cooperation. And this is still the case, unfortunately. And this is the silver lining, and this is interesting maybe for the people who view this and the people who listen to us, is there is cooperation. This is the good news, because the scientific community, and these are the guys who actually will save us all. It's not going to be politicians. It's not going to be business. At the end of the day, it's going to be scientists, immunologists, virologists, biologists, epidemiologists, and others, and medical personnel, of course, and those are also scientists, and they cooperate. They read each other's papers, they communicate, they write together on papers. I give you another example. There is a group of scientists who work in Vienna on a vaccine. The company is called Themis Bioscience, and they work with a group in Pittsburgh University, and they work with another group in the Pasteur Institute in Paris. And this is just one of the groups who work on a vaccine right now. And then there's many, many others, and all those people cooperate because they need each other. One person has to do clinical trials at the end. One person has to work with statistics. They need computer modeling. They need modeling of proteins, of viruses, of anything, they need biochemists, etc., and all of these people, they cooperate. And I think that is the thing, how this will end. That fortunately enough, we have scientists who work on this, and it be either a medication that works, or it may be that would be the first thing, that there will be tests. They're already online. There's medical trials with the medication. Also, that looks good. And the next step is the vaccine. And this is our exit scenario. And the good thing is, politicians are, I think, really this big disappointment in the most part. Actually, also here, Europe is an exception, because when there was a donor conference for financing the vaccine, Europe was heavily involved with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, CEPI, the WHO, and others. And who was not there? The Chinese. the Americans, India, they were absent. And so I think I should actually somehow spare Europe the criticism in this, because they are the good guys in this game. But again, scientists cooperate, they work on the problems, and fortunately and hopefully we will get a medication and a vaccine. When that will be, I don't know. But this is how this will end.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for sharing your knowledge with us. And listeners, if you want to hear and read more of Thomas' work, please, you can read the Wiener Zeitung in the next days, where his current articles and interviews will be published. And you can read his books, Pazifische, Epoche and Schwarzbuch. Thomas, what's the best way to stay in your loop, to get in contact with you?
Yes, the best thing is to follow me on Twitter. That's where I usually share these kind of things that we've been talking about. And I share mostly on economic issues, geopolitical issues, and COVID in general. So Twitter is good. If you want to see the light side, unfortunately, there's not much to tell at the moment. You can follow me on Instagram as well. Always, it's like Thomas Seifert, one word. You can do that as well on Facebook. I'm there as well. But again, in the Wiener Zeitung, you find my work. And also, I will put a link to this video that we do here that will later on be archived there as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. This was the second time on the show. Please come back soon for the third time. We need you, Thomas.
Yes. Just as an ending, I did an interview with Robert McElwain, I told you, and he wrote this book about the Great Depression. And he says, whenever journalists call me, it's not a good time. I know that something is not good, and I hope I'm not going to be that kind of person. So please, hopefully, the next time we have a conversation, we're going to be talking about the positive things, and we can be talking about how things are gradually getting better.
We will see. Thank you, Thomas.
Hopefully. Simon.
Bye-bye.
Entrepreneurial freedom is awesome. It's also a lot of hard work to get there. And when you are there, it's easy to lose your grip. Our community of over 16,000 entrepreneurs is getting stronger and stronger every week because we amplify each other. We share what works and drop the rest. We test, refine, improve. Check strategysprints.com/clarity to level up your business and have fun doing it.